Jai Janendra, welcome. I'm Professor Christopher Jane Miller, and I'm joined here by my colleagues, Tine Wekemans at Ghent University and Marie-Hélène Gorisse at University of Birmingham. This is the Dialogues in European Jain Studies collaborative speaker series that we're bringing you for the academic year 2024-2025. And we welcome you all, and we thank you all for coming to this event, Consciousness in Jainism. Before I hand it over to my colleagues to begin the event, I just wanted to briefly let you all know that there is a Q&A box that you can interact with us through. So if you have questions, we encourage you to drop your questions into the Q&A box. We will see them on our end, and we will field as many questions as we can around this very fascinating topic. We will also be dropping occasionally links into the chat, for example, to register for our future events. If you're interested, we have a monthly event running all the way through the month of May. So I'll drop some of the links into the chat for you to see and visit. And without further delay, now I will turn it over to my colleague, Tine Wekemans, who's going to introduce our presider and MC today. Thank you, Tine.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you online joining us today for a fascinating panel on Jain philosophy, different talks touching upon the idea of consciousness. So our speakers today, our first presenter will be Sri Nahata, who recently completed his PhD from the University of Oxford. Shri's research interests include Buddhist and Jain philosophy, and that kind of comparison, that coming together, is also what he will be speaking on today. And furthermore, also is very interested in Persian poetry, and essentially, as far as I have gotten to know him, speaks Sanskrit fluently. Then our second speaker will be Jane Allred from the University of Alberta. She is currently finishing her PhD with a dissertation on the multifaceted philology through vernacular grammar. So she connects our topic today, philosophy, consciousness, with grammar and linguistics. The person giving us an introduction and helping us to make sense of all this richness today will be Marie-Hélène Gorisse, whom I have had the pleasure of working with at Ghent University before she set out to the University of Birmingham, where she is now professor in Jain Studies, and she heads the Dharmanath Network in Jain Studies, a budding but very interesting and studious collective of people studying Jainism, but also looking at the societal impact of Jainism and non-violence, etc. So I think I will hand it over to Marie-Hélène of University of Birmingham to start this session proper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tina, for this. What is this session all about? Let me come back to the very basics, because the expression consciousness covers actually a wide variety of mental phenomena. So we can say that an animal, a person, or any other cognitive system may be regarded as conscious in the generic sense of being capable of sensing its world and of responding to its world. But already here, you know that the boundaries are blurry, because it is not always clear when the sensing, the responding really starts. For example, are bacteria conscious in this way? At least they can adapt to their surroundings. So here, Jaina classifications are so vast as to include not only bacteria, but also one-sensed organisms such as atoms of water in their list of conscious organisms. Next to this, one might require that an organism is conscious only if it actually exercises such a capacity. So not when it is asleep, hypnotized, in shock, or in a coma. So here too, boundaries are blurry and theorists disagree. But all Jaina thinkers in my science advocate that whichever the states of the organism, it is minimally conscious. Because what ultimately makes an organism conscious is that it is the embodiment of a soul. And this soul is, all that. This soul is a permanent divine-like entity, which is unobstructed knowledge, perception, bliss, and energy. It is without part, it is not physical, yet it can expand up to the size of the universe. But more usually, the soul is coextensive with the body it occupies, really like light in a room. So, and this is what explains that I have sensation from the top of my head to the tip of my toes. So all that Jain religious practices are orientated towards becoming this pure soul, this pure consciousness that we are. And if the embodied complex seems poorly conscious, it is only due to external factors that impede the innate powers of that soul. So a final example of a criterion is that it could be also required that an organism is called conscious, not only when they are aware, but also when they are aware that they are aware. For example, to have a conscious desire for a cup of coffee is to have such a desire and to be simultaneously aware of that desire. So this self-awareness can be conceptual or not, or linguistic or not. So there are many non-human animals might fall to qualify as conscious. But again, in principle, from a Jain perspective, every living being qualifies as a conscious creature by definition. So now, all philosophers agree that consciousness is essential to thought. We cannot explain that our thoughts arise without the existence of consciousness, whatever consciousness is. And same with personal identity. We cannot explain that I recognize myself as being the same person from one moment to another and as being different from other persons without consciousnness. So this is quite an important concept. However, most philosophers disagree on what consciousness is, and especially on the substantial basis of it. So let me give you as an example a stance which is obviously very remote from the Jaina one, which is called the bundle theory of mind. On this theory, what is called soul, consciousness, is actually nothing more than collections of ideas. There is no need at all to postulate a substrate for these ideas. And indeed, when we think about consciousness, for example, when we make scientific experiments to sort out the nature of consciousness, we are not working with souls, we are working with conscious mental states. That's our data. So some argue that this is too big of a jump to go from the existence of these mental states to the existence of one single support of this. That would be called a soul. So consciousness science has made great progress, and especially during the 3 last decades. We have lots of data and much better understanding of the physical correlates of conscious experience. Yet there are many, many competing approaches, and we are far from having a single self-consistent theory of consciousness, even today. Thinkers especially disagree on the relationship between conscience and matter. What is the relationship between the mental and the physical? Can a purely physical system be conscious? These questions drag with them a whole galaxy of related questions. What are the different faculties that enable me to have a conscious experience? How do my soul, my embodied faculties, cognitive faculties, and the data coming from the external world combine for me to have a conscious experience? Do I have similar experiences than others? What is the simple kind of conscious experience that we know? Shall we start with pure awareness like in meditation? That is, shall we start with consciousness free from thoughts and sensory perceptions? And also, is artificial intelligence at all possible? So all these questions are both very important ones and still very much debated today. So in the different periods of the development of Jainism, Jaina philosophers too had to venture responses to this seminal question that still are very important today. And I claim that Jaina views are unique and that they can contribute to current debates. So I think I don't have much more minutes, but I will now take a few more minutes just to indicate how Jain's views are unique, in which text these views can be found, and to point to some of the associated scholarship. And of course, I won't be exhaustive here. So first, Jaina philosophers, they want to account for the fact, as you know, our pure soul is totally isolated and immaterial, while our conscious experiences happen as part of the activities of a material complex that somehow includes this soul. So, of course, depending on the author, depending on the philosophical genre or on the period, the ways of solving this tension are different ones, even within Jainism. But they are typically, not always, but typically linked with theories of karma. And when they are, one thing that makes Jainism distinct is that thinkers tend to discuss conscious states as states with various degrees of impeding material karmic substances. So you know that there are four types of harming karmic substance, four types of harming karmic matter, and that each of them reduce innate consciousness in a way. And this enables Jaina thinkers to define conscious states in terms of the types and degrees of disassociation between soul and matter. And so here we have 5 main types of consciousness, which are listed depending on whether this is a state in which karma is suppressed, but still at the bottom, or fully destroyed, or fully prolific, or fully absent. So a metaphor that helps conceptualize this is found in Pujapada's commentary of the Tattva Sutra, where conscious states of the soul bound with karmic matter are compared to muddy waters. Muddy waters are impure, and what one doesn't see through these muddy waters, but if they are not stirred for a sufficient amount of time, thanks to a process of sedimentation, the dust will settle at the bottom and the water will be pure again and clear again. So similarly, we have another metaphor found in Kunda Kunda, who compares conscious states of the bound soul to the reflection of a red flower on a crystal. And their pure consciousness and karmic matter creates conscious states without touching even each other. So all this to say simply that starting with the postulate of an absolute consciousness, of an absolute pure consciousness, which is substance but immaterial, non-physical, and then trying to explain why lesser states of it are experienced, and doing so using the mechanics of a subtle type of matter, the karma, which works as an intermediary and which enables thinkers to use laws of association akin really to laws of physics. That is something that I have not seen anywhere else than in Jainism. No, conceptions like this are developed in manuals of philosophy that develop the theory at the background of the Jain path to liberation, and that, interestingly, usually also include exegetical and epistemological considerations. So let me focus on recent research on this type of manuals of materials that are helpful in sketching the history of Jain conceptions of consciousness. So we have works like William Johnson's Harmless Souls, or Christy Willey's works since her dissertation on harmless karmas as agent of embodiments in Jainism. And today we have also very interesting lines of research, for example, that's developed by Anna Bagel, for example, in the forthcoming paper, Jaina Non-One-Sided Metaphysics of the Self in the Tattva Sutra and commentaries. So next to these manuals of philosophy, there is a textual tradition more focused on theories of knowledge that is developed, and these more technical, the other ones were technical already, but those technical texts are also fundamentals of epistemology, are also fundamental to understand how knowledge and consciousness and the relation between myself and the world, between the physical and the mental, work in Jainism. So there, let me mention, of course, the exhaustive work of Piotr Balcerowicz, like the philosophy of mind in Kunda Kunda and Ulmaswati, or Siddhasena and Akalanka, A Revolution in Jaina Epistemology. And I won't have time to quote all papers, so just all the fantastic work of all my colleagues. So here I'm thinking of Jayendra Soni on Upaya Yoga, Johannes Bronkhorst on Kunda Kunda and the Soul, or Shin Fujinaga, Tomoyoko Uno, Olo Kanstrom, Hima Trika, Anne Clavel, Anine Boudra, Gina Shet. We have also Raja Rosenhagen and many more. And of course, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, especially Padmana Jaini, Naginsha, and many more before them. So one of the speakers today, I'm really thrilled about that, is Sri Nahata, who will speak from this epistemological perspective, especially on Dharmakirti versus Akalanka on the nature, object, and structure of perception. No, I wanted to quote two other lines of research that are also of interest for our topic. The first is in philosophy of language. There also Jains have a lot to say concerning the relationship between the different levels at play when an embodied organism gets to know something. So Margojata Glinica is working on this, as is Jen Arrett, whose paper today on Bhatta Kalanka and Yashovijaya on the relationship between grammar, language, and understanding. I am really looking forward to. And finally, the very final line I wanted to put here today is that scholars are also investigating a Jaina way of overcoming the hard problem of consciousness by investigating the status of aesthetic emotions. Here I'm especially thinking of the work of Sasha Restifo, who presented in our series Aesthetics and Philosophy, the Rasa of Knowledge in Amrita Chandra. And in her recent work, she has also shown that passions and emotions are like a glue between the immaterial soul and material karma, as they are both internal cognitive processes and embodied karmic modes. So my time is up. I hope that I could convey the importance of the work done on the theme of consciousness in Jainism, how it is really important today, and how exciting new research is on this is currently. So I will now let the speakers present their research on issues that contribute to this whole background. And Shri, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Tine and Marie-Hélène, for a wonderful introduction to the topic. I mean, it's really kind of daunting to jump in after that. But as Marie-Hélène was saying, the topic is consciousness. So I'll be focusing on a particular aspect of consciousness today, one of the faculties, one of the pramanas, which is perception. And looking at the audience, I'm a bit daunted because my examiner, Professor Jain Soni, is there, and there are like lots of professors who know way more about the topic. So I'd be curious to get their feedback in the Q&A. So Dharmakirti and Akalanka on the nature and structure of perception. I've chosen 2 out of the 3 sub-issues just due to constraints of time. So I understand that not everybody in the audience today is necessarily a philosopher. So just some background. So Dharmakirti lived around the early 7th century. Dates are contested. He wrote around 7 independent philosophical treatises, of which the most important ones are the Pramana Vartika and the Pramana Vinishchaya. These are the 2 I worked on for my thesis. And he is definitely the most influential Buddhist philosopher after Nagarjuna. Tibetan monks still read his treatises today, memorize them in the Tibetan translations, debate them, etc. And there are lots of things going on in philosophical treatises, but one we say is the central theme is Buddhist apologetics. This means that Dharmakirti wants to show that the central Buddhist teachings are true, not just because the Buddha taught them and we believe the Buddha, but because they make sense rationally. So he wants to provide rational arguments to defend most of the central Buddhist teachings. So in terms of his epistemology, so Dharmakirti defines pramana as, so pramana is basically the central term in Indian epistemology, which basically means both a source of knowledge, this is as well as the act of knowing. So this is because of the ambiguity of the Sanskrit suffix. But for our purposes, it means a source of knowledge. So how do we know things in the world? There are different ways. One of them is perception. We see things, we hear things. Another is inference. So the key question is, how do we define pramana and what these pramanas are? This is where the entire debate in Indian philosophy around the middle of the first millennium hinges. So Dharmakirti defines pramana as non-contradictory awareness. And what does he mean by non-contradiction? He defines non-contradiction as anything that is conducive to pragmatic activity, artha kriya. So what's interesting for our purposes is that Dharmakirti essentially offers a kind of pragmatic definition of pramana, where truth in modern terms is analyzed in terms of pragmatic utility. And a cognition is true if it's capable of leading to successful pragmatic activity. There are 2 pramanas in Dharmakirti, perception and inference. We'll be focusing on perception. Perception apprehends particulars, inference apprehends universals. So again, a bit of background, the Buddhists believe that complex wholes are not real, chariots are not real, persons are not real. The only things that are real are partless atomic entities. And for Dharmakirti, these are like momentary, partless property particulars, like a momentary instant of blue, a momentary instant of heat. Those are the only things that are real. Everything else is things constructed by our mind, which don't ultimately exist. And of course, I think many of us in the audience and many of us who work on Indian philosophy would know that there's a distinction between two levels of truth in Dharmakirti. There's ultimate truth, which is Paramartha Sat, and then there's conventional truth, which is Samvriti Sat. Okay, then we have perception. So how does Dharmakirti define perception? He defines perception as non-conceptual and non-erroneous awareness. So what's very interesting about this definition is that perception does not involve any concepts. So any kind of concepts we have, including not just the verbalization of things using words, but also concepts in our mind, any awareness which has these concepts does not count as perception. Perception is awareness which is completely free from all concepts, both mental as well as verbalizable concepts. And he accepts four kinds of perception: sensory, mental, self-reflexive, and yogic perception. For our purposes today, we'll focus on sensory perception, which is what we ordinarily understand by perception: seeing things with our eyes, hearing things with our ears, and so on. Okay, so Akalanka. Many of us would know that Akalanka is one of the most influential philosophers in the Jaina tradition, especially in the Digambara Jaina tradition. He's the most influential philosopher, one could say, after Samantabhadra. He lived in the 8th century. He was really a polymath. He wrote commentaries on canonical Jain texts like the Tattvartha Sutra, but he also wrote independent philosophical treatises. In my thesis, I mainly worked on his independent philosophical treatises because that's where he's more interested in arguing with non-Jain interlocutors. The commentaries are more directed to an internal Jain audience about how to interpret texts and so on. And the two texts I worked on were the Laghiyastraya and the Nyaya Vinishchaya. What's interesting about Akalanka is the extent to which he is polemical. He has studied all the philosophical schools of his time, and he's interested in refuting all of them and showing that the Jain philosophical view is the most sound. So that's already interesting that he's a polymath, not just within the Jain tradition, but across Indian philosophy of his time. He knows about all the major schools. Again, Akalanka's epistemology, just as a background. So pramana, a source of knowledge for Akalanka, is a determinate awareness, vyavasayatmakam jnanam. And it is something which is free from internal contradiction. So this kind of agrees with Dharmakirti, as well as external sublation, and which apprehends both itself as well as a previously unknown object. So this definition is very complex. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but it basically takes elements from Dharmakirti as well as the Nyaya Sutras, and then gives a distinctively Jain interpretation of some things. Two pramanas, again, just like Dharmakirti, Akalanka accepts two pramanas, but the two pramanas are slightly different. One of them is perception, but the other is indirect awareness, paroksha, which basically includes not just inference, but also linguistic cognition, shabda, which also includes scripture, the Jaina scriptures. But he also accepts other kinds of pramanas like arthapatti and upamana and all of these things which are accepted by realist Hindu schools. But for our purposes, we'll be focusing on perception. And both perception as well as indirect awareness, the two pramanas, apprehend many-sided real entities. So this is Anekantavada, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Entities have multiple, infinitely many properties, Ananta Dharmatmakata, and they are both substance and mode. They are both universal and particular. And perception apprehends these real, multi-sided, many-sided entities which exist out there in the world. And focusing on perception, perception is defined as clear, spashtam or vishadam, jnanam, and conceptual awareness of external objects as well as itself. So you can already see a major division, a point of contention rather, between Dharmakirti and Akalanka. So Dharmakirti's definition of perception defines perception as precisely that kind of cognition which is free from all concepts, whereas Akalanka defines perception as precisely that kind of awareness, cognition, which is completely conceptually infused. Akalanka accepts three kinds of perception: sensory, mental, extrasensory perception. We'll focus on sensory perception today. So just before we get into the arguments, I wanted to show that to read Akalanka, you need to have read Dharmakirti, and that is the basic point. So you can see that there are different ways in which he engages with Dharmakirti. Sometimes he just quotes. So like Artha Kriya Arthi Hi Sarvav Prekshavan Pramanam Apramanam Van Veshate. And that's Dharmakirti. Akalanka arthakriya arthi pramanam apramanam vanveshate. So he's just removed two words, but otherwise it's a direct quote. Then there's paraphrase, Samhritya Sarvatash Chintam, that's Dharmakirti. Akalanka replaces it with a single Bahuvrihi compound, Samhrita Shesha Chintayam, which means the same thing. Then there's inversion. So you have Dharmakirti who says Sahopalambha Niyamad, Abhedo Nila Tadhiyo. Akalanka says Sahopalambha Niyaman, Na Bhedo Nila Tadhiyo. He just adds a na, and he's just inverted Dharmakirti statement. And then there's also a lot of satire where he satirizes Dharmakirti. So he says Purva Pakshama Vijnaya Dushakopi Vedushakaha. So he calls Dharmakirti a clown, basically. So you can see how close the intertextuality is. And so if one wants to read Akalanka, at least his independent philosophical treatises, one needs to know Dharmakirti. Okay, so there are three main points of contention that I identified between them with regard to their theories of perception. Firstly, what's the nature of perception? Is it non-conceptual as Dharmakirti argues, or is it conceptual as Akalanka argues? Secondly, what's the object of perception? Dharmakirti is ultimately an epistemic idealist who believes that what we perceive is somehow in our heads, in our minds, not out there in the real, not real, but rather the external world. Whereas Akalanka is a common sense realist. He believes that what we perceive is out there in the external world. And then what is the structure of perception? Is it non-dual as Dharmakirti argues, or dual as Akalanka argues? So we'll be focusing on the first and the third points of contention today. So the first point of contention is perception conceptual. So what's at stake? Before we get into any debate, we should know what the actual debate is about so that it's not a merely linguistic or terminological debate. So Dharmakirti, as we saw, says perception is non-conceptual. And for Dharmakirti, conceptualization is any awareness whose object, whose appearance is capable of association with language. So it's not the case that you actually need to know the word for things, but if what you're experiencing or aware of is capable of being expressed by language, then it doesn't count as perception. Even if you don't know the particular, even if you don't have those concepts to express it. Whereas Akalanka says that perception is necessarily conceptual, but he has a slightly different definition of conceptualization. For him, conceptualization is limited ascertainment of an object. So for him, conceptualization is nirnaya or nishchaya. It's when I say that this dove, for example, is a bird which is white in color. When I identify a specific feature of a specific real entity and cognize it in that determinate way, then I basically have a conceptual awareness. So because they have different definitions of conceptualization, it's really important to sort through what they actually are arguing about. And what I realized after sorting through it is that both of them agree that perception does not involve language for verbalized speech. So verbalized speech is not a part of perceptual awareness proper. Dharmakirti, obviously, he's a non-conceptualist. He would buy into that. But Akalanka also agrees with that. What they disagree about is whether perception involves unverbalized mental linguistic concepts. So the concept of like a cow, which is a standard example in Indian philosophy, like, do I perceive the cow as a cow, seeing as in modern analytic philosophy? That's Akalanka. Whereas for Dharmakirti, you just see this particular with these shapes and colors and so on. You don't see it as a cow. That's the point of contention. So many arguments. For the sake of time, let's focus on some of the more interesting ones. So for Dharmakirti, conceptual awareness perception cannot be conceptual. Why? Here's a very simple argument. Let's say you're seeing a cow and you see it as a cow. For that to happen, what needs to be the case? Firstly, you need to have learned the word cow, or if you're speaking Sanskrit like Gauhu or whatever language you speak, you need to have learned the word at some point in your childhood. Secondly, when you're seeing this thing in front of you, you need to recollect or remember that word which you have learned earlier, and then associate it with what you're perceiving at that moment. So this conceptual awareness involves memory, Dharmakirti says. You need to have acquired the concept in the past, and you need to recollect the concept at the time you're seeing the entity. And memory in classical Indian philosophy is completely different from perception. Memory and perception are distinct because memory is about a past experience, whereas perception is about what you're seeing in the present. And so if conceptual awareness involves memory, then perception cannot be conceptual because memory and perception are completely distinct from each other. One is about a present entity and memory is about past experiences. So what does Dharmakirti think? Like, okay, he says that seeing things as cows or as leaves is an error. Ultimately, perception is non-conceptual. But how does this error arise? So for Dharmakirti, let's take the example of a leaf. What happens when we say that I saw a leaf? What we actually see for Dharmakirti is momentary instants of green. But they occur with such rapidity, like the projection of still images in a cinema hall, that we are misled into thinking that there is some green persisting across time. And then, because it's useful for us, we create a concept called leaf to denote this constructed entity persisting across time. And so that's how we see the world the way we do, as full of leaves and cows and trees, but that's not how things actually are. So Akalanka, he has things to say about memory as well, but his main approach to critiquing Dharmakirti is to show internal inconsistencies within Dharmakirti's philosophical system. So, okay, we saw that Dharmakirti defines pramana as something which is awareness, which is capable of leading to successful pragmatic activity. So Akalanka says, well, if you're a perceptual non-conceptualist, Dharmakirti, then how can you still hold on to this pragmatic definition of pramana? Because if you have a purely non-conceptual awareness of a momentary instant of green, then you can't actually use that to act in the world in any way. You need to actually perceive something as a leaf in order to then prune the leaf or do something with the leaf in the real world. So perceptual non-conceptualism cannot be true. Perception cannot be non-conceptual given your own definition of what a source of knowledge must be, i.e. it must be conducive to pragmatic activity. And then he also shows another internal inconsistency, that if you, Dharmakirti, accept the criterion of pragmatic activity, then how can you accept a momentary ontology? Because things must persist across time for us to be able to act on them, because we make plans in relation to the future, and that's how goal-directed activity across time functions. So again, pragmatic activity, this criterion of pramana, is inconsistent with Dharmakirti's ontology. But it goes further. There are other kinds of perception, as I briefly mentioned. Like there's yogic perception, which both Dharmakirti and Akalanka in different ways accept. And this is a kind of transcendental perception when you cognize the reality as it is, let's put it in simple terms. But yogis, on the basis of that perception, both Dharmakirti and Akalanka agree, do not act in the world because they are not self-interested agents who are trying to get or avoid things in the world. But if yogic perception is a kind of perception and it does not lead to successful pragmatic activity, as both Dharmakirti and Akalanka agree, then how can perception qua pramana be defined in terms of pragmatic activity? So there's a deep inconsistency, Akalanka argues, within Dharmakirti's entire epistemological project. The way he understands pramana, it completely conflicts with his theory of perception. So skipping over the second debate, we come to the third point of contention, which is subject-object duality, which I think might be interesting for a lot of us, because we hear about non-dualism, Advaita Vedanta, and all of these things are very popular, both in academic and in non-academic circles. So it's interesting to look at this debate. So Dharmakirti is a non-dualist, which means that for him, ultimate reality is non-dual awareness, which is both the pramana, the source of knowledge, and the prameya, the object of knowledge. This is obvious, right? If the pramana and prameya were distinct, there would be two things, and that would contradict non-dualism. So at the level of ultimate reality, we just have awareness aware of itself in a non-dual way. And Akalanka, it's interesting because one always thinks, okay, we have Advaita Vedanta, we have Buddhist non-dualism, but what is the Jain position, at least philosophically, on non-dualism? So Akalanka is completely against, philosophically speaking, non-dualism, because he says that, yes, awareness can be aware of itself, I accept that, but there must always be a duality between awareness, which is the apprehending subject, the grahaka, and the world, which is being apprehended, grahya. So it's very interesting because in this mid-first millennium CE, when non-dualism is very much in vogue, you have Jainas as being one of the fiercest and most interesting critics of non-dualism. So that's intrinsically interesting, I think, historically. And so the point of disagreement is clear. Is awareness non-dual or not? So Dharmakirti's non-dualism, why would anyone believe that things are non-dual? I mean, you can believe in the Upanishadic non-dualism through Brahman, through scriptural exegesis, but that's not Dharmakirti, obviously. Dharmakirti is in a different tradition. The way he approaches it is mereological reductionism. All complex wholes are unreal, only simple parts are real. So apply that principle to its logical extreme. Any awareness which is composed of parts like grahya and grahaka must be unreal because it's a composite whole. And therefore, if you apply this very Buddhist principle, which has nothing to do with the way the Vedantins get to non-dualism. You get to non-dualism because anything with parts is unreal. So the only thing that can be ultimately real for various other reasons is non-dual awareness, because it's completely undifferentiated and partless. But then why do we experience the world dualistically? Why do I feel like I am here and you are there and there's some sort of difference between us? That's because of ignorance, avidya. And the interesting thing is the meta philosophy, which I found very interesting, is that this ultimate nature of reality as non-dual awareness cannot be known through rational philosophical analysis. That's pretty obvious, because the basic starting point of all rational philosophical analysis is conceptual analysis and distinguishing between things. Without conceptual analysis and distinctions, you cannot have any philosophical argument. But if ultimate reality is free from all distinctions, how can conceptual and dualistic philosophical analysis lead to that non-dual, non-conceptual, undifferentiated ultimate reality? So Dharmakirti, he is very much one of the smartest logicians that India has ever produced, but he thinks that at the level of ultimate reality, things can only be known through meditative insight. Non-dual awareness is something you must cultivate by practicing as a Buddhist rather than something you can intellectually get to. So what are Akalanka's objections? I mean, he's very much a rationalist, interestingly, in this debate. He has no interest in like talking about what meditative insight might lead to or might not. Of course, there's a very sophisticated Jain meditative tradition, but Akalanka is much more interested in philosophical analysis. And he says, well, how do you prove that there is such a thing as non-dual awareness? Either it's proved by itself or by means of something else. It's not proved by itself because the way we ordinarily, automatically, by default perceive the world is dualistically. So it's not by itself, and it cannot be proved by means of anything else, because if there's something else, X, proving non-dual awareness, then you already have two things, non-dual awareness and X, which refutes the non-dual thesis. And he also says that this idea that there's this ignorance which explains how non-dual awareness manifests dualistically, that's absurd. Because what is the ontological status of this ignorance? Is this ignorance itself a real entity, a real phenomenon? If it is, then you have two real entities of phenomena, non-dual awareness and ignorance, which is obviously a problem. But if ignorance itself is unreal, then how can something which is unreal explain anything? So this idea that this ignorance is why we are mistaken and why we perceive things dualistically, Akalanka has no time for that. And metaphilosophically, of course, he's a Jain and he accepts scripture as a source of knowledge. But in this context, he says that the fundamental nature of reality can actually be known through pramanas. The Jinna's knowledge is just more complete. We just don't have a complete set. We don't know everything in reality, but whatever we know, everything in principle is knowable through pramanas. It's not that you have to get rid of pramana shastra and say that there is some sort of awareness or state which you can only know through meditative insight. So this is like a very, I mean, of course, not doing justice to either Dharmakirti or Akalanka, very crash summary of it. But how do you evaluate it? I mean, I'm interested in like what do you do when we read something like this? So there are three ways of doing it. Either you say that there's a winner and a loser, that you read as much as you can, read sympathetically, and then you say that, okay, X is right and Y is wrong. So this is what Nagin Shah did, which is interesting. He was born in a Jain tradition, but actually after reading all of it, he said Dharmakirti is right because Dharmakirti's arguments make way more sense and he had his reasons. So that's one approach you can take. The other thing you can say is just be neutral. I mean, we're doing history of philosophy. We needn't worry about who's right and who's wrong. All we're interested in is understanding what Dharmakirti's arguments are, what Akalanka's arguments are. That's it. And I think Piotr Balkerovich, who's a really good scholar, kind of does that. I mean, he keeps his own evaluation to a minimum. He's more interested in the history of ideas, how ideas evolve, what the arguments are, etc. So I was thinking, is there a third way? And my way of doing it was to say that both are right. And this is by applying Nayavada in a way that, disclaimer, no classical Jaina did. So I'm not claiming that this is what they were doing at all, because like I'm interested in how we can apply this in a modern way. And the basic insight of Nayavada is that when you have a contradiction, your instinct should be to say that this contradiction is kind of illusory because both statements are true relative to different parameters, relative to different contexts. So this is the fundamental insight. Of course, classical Jaina philosophers didn't take this to mean that non-Jaina philosophical schools are equally true with respect to different parameters. They just didn't. So I'm not claiming that. But how can we in a modern way apply this? So the way I view it is that, okay, non-conceptual, non-dual, that's Dharmakirti. Conceptual, dual, that's Akalanka. So how do we differentiate their epistemic stances such that the contradiction disappears? And I think what Dharmakirti is really doing is that he's taking a transformative or normative epistemic stance, Naya, towards perception, which is more concerned with transforming our ordinary perception of the world in accordance with some higher normative ideal, which is, of course, the Buddhist ideal. So Dharmakirti wouldn't deny that ordinarily things are conceptual and dual, but he's saying, like, no, ultimately, if you cultivate yourself and get to the and transform yourself, if you want to escape the cycle of suffering and reach this higher level of awareness, then at that level things are non-dual and non-conceptual. So for me, there is a transformative dimension. He's not denying that things are conceptual and dual ordinarily, but he's saying there's something beyond that, and if you cultivate yourself, you'll experience that. Whereas Akalanka is much more descriptive or practical. He's more interested in how do we ordinarily perceive the world, and how does our ordinary perception enable us to act in the world. So that's why for him perception is conceptual and dual, because that's how we ordinarily perceive things, and that's what enables us to act in the world. Only if there are distinctions and dualities can I actually act in any way. So if one takes this approach, then the contradiction disappears, because there's no contradiction between describing something as X and normatively transforming it into not X. But this is just my idiosyncratic interpretation, which has no historical or textual basis. So significance. So, I mean, why read all of this? I think one reason to read all of this is that Akalanka, in this Jain context, is one of the brightest minds in the history of Jain philosophy. And the level of thought that these great Jain philosophers put into analyzing perception or inference or consciousness is amazing. They considered so many possibilities and ways of thinking that if we were to not read them and just start from scratch, we would never be able to get to that level of sophistication of analysis. So I think it's like a treasure that's there in the Jain tradition, and it's just, even some of the arguments are even relevant and applicable today. So they're not like, they're actually interesting philosophically. And historically, I think what's interesting for me is that the Jain philosophical identity is always constituted by engaging with non-Jain philosophers. And Jain philosophers, more than pretty much any other religio-philosophical group that I'm aware of in pre-modern India, were always keen to engage with the religious other. And so for me, that's one thing that means, is that to be Jain is not to be insular. It's not to say that this is our tradition and we have our 10 books or whatever and we read them. Like, to be Jain in the classical age always meant to know everything about everyone, as even better than they themselves know their own position sometimes. Like, to read widely and engage with everyone. I think that's a beautiful model that's implicit in the classical tradition. And if you were to apply this to modernity, then being a Jain is not about retreating into something insular, but engaging with all modern forms of knowledge, which is exactly what the classical Jains were doing. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shri. That was wonderful. So much, wow, so much to discuss now. Yes, Jane, without further ado, I'm now letting you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, so there we go. Can y'all see that? I will assume so. And please do let me know on time if I'm running out, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so right. So yeah, thanks to everyone, the Arihanta Institute, Christopher, Marie-Hélène, Shri. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. And thanks especially to Marie-Hélène and Shri for doing a lot of my work in providing background for me. So yeah, so to follow up right from Shri's talk, I'm especially grateful that he talked about this issue of non-dualism, because it means I don't have to introduce it as much. And we're going to be talking about Jain engagements with another non-Buddhist form of this. Okay, so and we're talking about this specifically in the realm of thinking about language and the philosophy of language. So in thinking about this, one way I tend to think about translating this concept that we're going to be talking about Shabda Bodha, or verbal awareness, is I've lifted from modern analytic philosophy in talking about developing a theory of meaning. And so in that sense, we say that the project here is to ask, okay, so what precisely do we understand when we understand a word, a sentence, a language? This is something, word and sentence definitely is something Indian philosophers talk about a lot. This idea of understanding a language, that's more the modern analytic philosophy, though it'd be interesting to apply it to earlier. Okay, and one thing that I propose to talk about, I'm a little more ambivalent about presenting it as translatable to the past than when I originally was, but I think it's still useful, is to think about this idea in linguistics that's a little dated from what I understand, and replaced by other ways about thinking about a similar concept. So that's between deep structure and surface structure. So it's getting at the idea that we can say one thing and another thing, and they could also express the same. We might say thought, or to bring that back to consciousness, and so on. So we have Jane cooks rice, rice is cooked by Jane. So in both those, they express the same action, right? That someone named Jane, maybe me, is cooking rice, right? So yeah, so one question we may ask to this is, okay, so is this common idea, is it real, or is it something that's just sort of theoretically helpful, but not something like that actually exists in our, we could say mind, or even if we're getting really out there in realism, this thought out there. Right. So yeah, so this thing about the narrow sense, I was taking a little bit from trying to translate these ideas to modern times, but I think in the way these ideas have been applied to thinking about Sanskrit grammar, a very common case is thinking about this strange and interesting grammatical concept we get as early as the grammarian Panini in the 4th century BC of katakas. So this is one of these terms like pramana, which is, everyone has a different translation. So it's essentially a role that it explains the role a participant in an action has and relates to the action. So in the Jane cooks rice, we have the subject, the cooker of the rice, and the rice is the one being cooked. And so in a language like Sanskrit and many others, including Kannada, which I'll be talking about later, we encode these relationships by assigning different nominal cases, essentially different endings we put onto the word. And this doesn't always align. So there's certain moments where it looks like the sentence should be, whatever is expressed should be the object, but it has some other case, maybe subject, maybe one of these ones we haven't talked about, instrument, or so on. So in order to deal with the fact that these don't always line up, we could say maybe this category exists. So, or we can go even deeper and try and interpret as some of these more grammatical philosophical theories as even going further than that. So what I'm going to be talking about here is Jain engagements with this grammatical philosophy. So there's a very important thinker in that, Bhartrihari, who took some of these earliest Sanskrit grammatical texts starting from the 4th century and came up with a philosophical system out of it which can generally be put as a form of one of these non-dual, but one of these Brahminical, or we could say Hindu, versions of that. And so it has a different idea of ultimate reality than maybe the Buddhist does. And for Bhartrihari in particular, he's referring to the linguistic nature of ultimate reality. And so we have Brahma, or ultimate reality, as word. So this word spota, anyone who's a Sanskritist here probably knows it. It means like a bursting forth. And so we can think of this through several examples. So it's when we try and recall a name when we're speaking and maybe forget it, there's a certain, we have this idea that has come to us, but we can't quite translate it. But then so that's one spota, that idea that we're trying to express. And then there's the sudden flash of meaning when we think, oh, I remember the name. And when listening, when we hear a word, so for Sanskrit in the room, when we heard spota, the meaning of it instantly came to mind. So that's the general idea. What we might also call this is a holistic theory of meaning that when we interpret the fundamental spota, so there's different levels which we'll talk about, but when we talk about the fundamental spota, it's again part of this sort of non-dual awareness, this undivided ultimate reality. So that's the classical formulation from Bhartrihari. We may also identify this neoclassical formulation starting in the 16th century in Benares. So we have Shesha Krishna, Bhattoji, and so on. And these are mainly grammarians. And starting with Bhattoji, who's a very devoted Advaitin, so one of these schools of Hindu philosophy, spota comes in as sort of his approach to the theory of meaning as an Advaitin. So, but we get a little of difference where he's really worried about, because he's talking about linguistic awareness, he's really worried specifically on what spota expresses. And so ultimately, it would be Brahma as well, but there's a bit of a difference in orientation. Okay, so what about the Jains, right? So my main goal in this talk, first present two contemporaries. One, people who are familiar with Jain philosophy probably know about, one probably not, and that's one of my main goals, to try and be his advocate and say, well, he has interesting stuff to say, or help us learn about Jainism in this time period of the 16th and 17th centuries. And I really would love to look at differences that arise from this, but it's something which I just see more similarities right now in my research. So I want to show some of these ideas of broad consensus. So the main one we're going to be focused on in bold is that we have this empiricist account of language acquisition, and it's informed also by Jain epistemology. Most particularly, this theory of anaikantavada, or non-one-sidedness. A couple things that are also there that we're not going to get into too much, but are interesting. So we have the material basis of language that's in a way shared with Nyaya Vaisheshika, but pretty unique to Jains. Very unique to Jains is the consideration of not just sound as a means of linguistic expression, but also gestures and written symbols. But sound is still the stock example. And one other thing is to talk about back to what Marie-Hélène was introducing, in the relationship between consciousness and our embodied self. There's this explanation of linguistic capacity through karma theory. So people who know this is the nama karma, specifically these harmless karmas that determine how our mind, body, and speech develop. So we have this threefold idea of these three things: mind, body, and also speech as its own faculty. So the people we're talking about, so first, the main subject of my research so far is a person named Bhattacalankadeva, which that's what we call him, but he is quite literally named after the Akalanka, which Sri talked about, who you can also see is also called Bhattacalankadeva. But for convenience, we're going to use the name Bhattacalankha for him, and just Akalanka for the original one. These words Bhatta and Deva are both sort of honorifics. Okay. So, yeah, so even though he demonstrates that he was a polymath himself, we only have one text from him, and that's a manual on the Kannada language, or the Karnataka Shabdanusasana, which he specifically tells again and again, this is written for kids or teenagers, whatever the word bala means, but for students. But it reveals, and this is one of the main things I'm trying to point to, it reveals a lot of interesting discussions and hints at them. And so it can be a very good guide, and that's sort of what I'm doing in this talk. So, and I specifically want to say, when he talks about philosophy, he specifically points readers to Samanta Bhadra's Aptamimamsa, on which Akalanka, the one she was talking about, wrote a commentary called the Ashashati. So this is an important text. Some details: he's from modern-day Uttara Kannada. He's specifically in the mountains of that area, but it's also near the coast, which is what his particular line where they came from. If you know these terms of Mula Sangha Pustaka Gacha, that's what he's from. He's also from the Deshigana and Kunda Kunda Anvaya. And next, which most of you who know about Jain philosophy will have heard of, is Yashovi Jayaganan, who is essentially I think in contemporary sort of memory, he's sort of the Jain philosopher of this era. And this is one thing I want to add more to. So he's from Gujarat, studied logic in Benares. Is extremely prolific, was especially noted as Sri was talking about this Jain proclivity for dialogue with the other. He extended this also to the other within his own tradition, which can be hard. These rivalries within one's own tradition often are much more bitter. And this culminated in the fact that he contributed to this Digambara commentarial tradition by writing a commentary on the Aptamimamsa. So that's Ashtasahasri Tatparya Vivarana. We'll just call it the Vivarana because that's his layer of it. Okay, so to get back a little more on so what are we talking about the Jain philosophy of language and their ideas of language? Where I'm sort of start in someone who's thinking about this a lot theoretically is Pujyapada Devanandan. So specifically, he wrote one of the earliest post-Pauninian grammatical texts. So Paunini is that earliest grammarian. This is much later, but it's a significant text. And I'm interested particularly in this line: grammatical derivation arises from many facets, or siddhyara anekantat. So we see that word from anekantavada. And this is quite odd as a grammatical rule, because often when we get these grammatical texts, they're very programmatic and they just try and state in simplest terms possible the different linguistic operations. Occasionally you do get sort of comments on meta language, which is sort of where this falls in, but it's also just very philosophical for one of these. So it's a very interesting, and one of the things I want to show in this talk is how it has a lot of staying power in these Jain traditions. we get an example of what this actually means in application from Abhayanandan. And I'm going to show us a very similar case of what Abhayanandan does in Bhattacharya's Grammar of Kannada. And so, but just an example for that, one of these, in Anayakantavada, we are looking at similarities and dissimilarities and as means of understanding a single thing. So he establishes similarity and dissimilarity of long and short vowels. There's a sense in which they are similar, and there's a sense in which they are not, and that what makes them sort of vowels of the same class. He also has his philosophical commentary that's very famous, and is one of the earliest texts to explicitly refer to non-one-sidedness. So you have a long prehistory, but this is where sort of the meta language around it is coalescing. Okay, and so now we're turning again. We know about Akalanka, so we're going to use him as a guide. So he has this dispute with Bhartrihari on the eternality of language, and it appears in several places. Ashtashati is one. Also in his commentary on Pujyapada's commentary on the Tattvartha Shastra, so that one back here. And it appears in a very similar form in these. So he clearly has a similar program that he is applying to different contexts. This is sort of coordinate, a hybrid dispute with the school of Mimamsa. Another dispute which we aren't really talking about is the nature of language's material basis. So what's the medium of sound? For Naya Vaisheshika, it's Akasha, which is space or empty space, whereas it's matter for the Jains. So that's one debate that's there. And also, we heard from Sri a little bit on debates with the Buddhists. There's also debates with the Buddhists' theory of meaning.
I just housekeeping things. You have 1 or 2 minutes, so I don't know if we can focus on one argument.
Yes, okay.
So sorry.
I'm sorry. I must have been too long in background. Okay, so yes. Now what I want to talk about is how Yashovijaya and Bhattacharya approach these questions of grammatical philosophy. So with Yashovijaya, it draws from this dispute Akalanka makes with Bhartrihari, but he applies it to his contemporary. So these are the neoclassical Spoto theorists. We do not have time then to go through all of these, but the important point here is that so Yashovijaya essentially quotes in long form a text from one of these theorists, Kaundabhatta, and then provides a critique. And so the text he's providing in long form says that meaning expresses increasingly higher levels of reality. So there's that flash of insight when we grasp a morpheme, so the final S of she cooks, rather than I cook. And then it goes on, and you can look, and these more express higher and higher levels of reality that are more real, right? So, to get to Yashovijaya's critique, he points at these last three and says that they're essentially redundant. What I find interesting is he brings up this Jain theory of Nayas, which we briefly referenced. So he notes that in this discussion, which we don't have time to look in the details, but he notes that there's a similar thing going on with the Jain theory of Nayas or standpoints. And that is they are talking about these in the Jain way of thinking. We can think of a substance and its modes. So we have some sort of a plant or something that over time changes. And so we can say the thing that changes over time is the substance, and those particular states of that plant are its modes. And so he points out that these new Sphota theorists have this, but he critiques them for dismissing them and saying essentially the hierarchical being, that he's saying that, well, we should do away with them in the end. So this also, I think, draws into the original Akalanka's critique of the Buddhists, but here applied to someone else. And then we get this very colorful verse that he says to one of these famous Indian philosophy disses. So he says that in arriving at ultimate and ineffable reality, even though it is linguistic in nature, we can't express it. The grammarian has rendered himself powerless by cutting the net he had previously woven around himself, and he's now in free fall. So he shouldn't have abandoned the previous ones. And Yashovijaya directly refers not to Devanandan's grammatical sutra, but another grammarian, Jain grammarian, Hemachandra, has his own spin on it. But because we talked about Siddhir Anekantat, we can say, well, they should have remembered Siddhir Anekantat and not abandoned these prior standpoints. Since I don't have time, I really did want to give you this grammar lesson, but the gist of it is we see in Bhattacharya a different approach to understanding how this cognition develops first from this level of just understanding that there is an expressiveness to these different morphemes, and then gives us an understanding of how this works. But we don't have time, so maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this. Wow. So much I want to ask. Maybe we'll come back to this during the Q&A, I hope, because that was really fascinating, actually. I would love to hear more about these arguments on hierarchy of Sphota also. Let me check. We already have a few questions in the Q&A here. So those first questions are addressed to Shri. I don't know if Shri, if you have read them. So let me read them aloud for everybody. So the first one is from Anil Mundra. If Dharmakirti wouldn't deny that things are ordinarily, practically conceptual and dual, etc., as Akalanka claims, but considers those appearances to be ultimately distorted, doesn't that mean that if he's right, Akalanka is either wrong or less right than him? Does Akalanka explicitly address his distinction between ultimate and conventional truth?
Yeah, so those are great questions. I mean, to say that if Akalanka is right, then if Dharmakirti is right, then Akalanka is wrong, is basically correct if you view it in historical terms, because they are making competing inconsistent claims. But what I was trying to do was adjudicate from a neutral standpoint rather than taking the historical standpoint. So let's think of it this way. Is there any, everyone agrees that there is, our ordinary awareness of the world is conceptual and dual. The Akalanka agrees, Dharmakirti agrees. The difference is Dharmakirti says this is illusory, Akalanka says this is real. Okay, so what is the further thing that's really under dispute is whether there is non-conceptual and non-dual awareness. And I think on this point, I must say that I don't find the arguments necessarily conclusive, because I don't see how philosophical and a priori or armchair philosophical analysis can show that non-conceptual or non-dual awareness, which is meant to be attained through meditative cultivation, is in principle impossible. So I don't think that philosophical arguments can prove that. So then the way I view this debate is that, okay, at the level of conventional reality in the ordinary world in which we live, it's the Akalanka has a better analysis of things, because he explains how perception contributes to our pragmatic activity. Whereas if we say that perception is non-conceptual, then there's no way of explaining our ordinary activity in the world. But as an object, as trying to be neutral, I don't see any in principle reason why this kind of transformative, why this kind of transformation of our consciousness, to relate it to the theme of today's conversation, is impossible. I don't see any in principle reason why non-dual and non-conceptual awareness is impossible. So I think Dharmakirti is most charitably viewed as providing a transformative path, which is of course a Buddhist path, to transform our awareness to something which he thinks is soteriologically more efficacious and more meaningful. And that's how I interpret ultimate reality. And the whole point of using epistemic stances is precisely to say that there is no hierarchy, right? Because it's not that Dharmakirti's perspective, because the Buddhists have conventional and ultimate truth, but there's a hierarchy, that this non-dual, non-conceptual thing is superior somehow to this conceptual dual thing. I think what the Jaina Nayavada does very well is that all perspectives are at the same level and equally valid. So there's no sense in which the conceptual dualistic perception we have in our ordinary lives is somehow superior or inferior to the non-dual, non-conceptual awareness cultivated by meditative practitioners in a different context. They're just different contexts with people trying to achieve different things. So, I mean, of course, you are right that if we view things historically, it is an inconsistency and only one person can be right. I'm just trying to view it sympathetically to show that both of them have something interesting to say, and how can we resolve the inconsistency using a Jain principle, which is Nayavada. And yeah, does Akalanka address the distinction between like Samvriti Sat and Paramartha Sat? Like the short answer is not in it, what I've read. So he doesn't do that because it seems like that is precisely what he should be targeting. This very idea that Buddhists get to have multiple levels of truth, and therefore they can hold on to many inconsistent theories at the same time. Like it can be X and then not X and then not, whatever. They have like Dharmakirti has 4 or 5 levels. It's not just 2 levels, actually. So he can accept everything and fit everything into his philosophical system. So I think the really smart approach, and I think this is what Haribhadra does based on what I've learned from talking to you, Anil, is that he attacks this very distinction between ultimate and conventional reality, which is the Buddhist way of saying that we kind of accept what you accept, but we also have this other thing. So attacking this is something I think that makes the most sense, like in a debate context, but I haven't seen Akalanka do. No.
Thanks a lot. I have a question for Jane now from an anonymous attendee. What role does Pratibha play in Bharatiya's Pota theory? And I'm interested to know whether there is some such related concept in the Jaina theory of language.
Okay, great and very specific question that I can maybe provide a basic gloss to the first part of that on what role does Pratibha play in the theory of Spota. And in terms of Jain analogs, I'm not quite sure. So from my memory of Spotavada, so we have the word Pratibha, and that would refer specifically, you're anonymous, so I don't know if you want to jump in, but it would refer specifically to that cognitive element of grasping the meaning of a particular statement, so that so again, that cognitive aspect is my very root understanding, which could be completely wrong, so do not ping me on this, but so if you have something more specific in mind, I would love to hear that. So in terms, I mean, what I can just maybe say in terms of thinking about, if I am right about that and thinking about a Jain analog, I don't know about a specific concept, but it would then be looking at Jain epistemology a little more closely, if that is right. So yeah, thanks. I definitely need to think about that more.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah, just let me scroll everything. Yeah, we have a question about a cow. So from Rajamani Chellamutu. So it's a question for Shri. How do the perspectives of Dharmakirti and Akalanka on perception influence our understanding of the whole versus the parts of a cow? And how can this understanding contribute to developing an ascetic mind in spirituality from the Jain point of view? Thanks.
Yeah,
From Chaitanya Prakash, yes, sorry.
Basically, the Buddhist view of the cow would be that there is no such entity as a cow. There's only like momentary property particulars, such as, let's say, a momentary instant of white color or a momentary instant of brown color, a momentary certain texture you might touch and feel, a particular sound that the cow might make. There are these momentary dharmas, as the Buddhists call them, which all exist. So different kinds of dharmas like visual, auditory can exist at the same time. But then these visual dharmas give rise to further visual dharmas across each moment. So a momentary white dharma would give rise to another momentary white dharma at the next moment. So there are only these momentary property particulars which we perceive. Our mind then combines them to come up with the idea of a complex whole called the cow, which persists across time. And we do this because it's useful for acting in the world, basically. But that's not what's ultimately real. There are no cows or trees or whatever. So that's the Buddhist view. The Jaina view is basically that, so the Buddhist view is that the whole is not real, only the parts are real. The Jaina view, Akalanka's view, is that both wholes and parts are real. The whole is composed of the parts, but not reducible to the parts. The whole is in some ways identical to the parts in the sense that it's composed of them, but it's in some ways distinct from the parts in the sense that it's not reducible to them. So this is like this anekantavada, this syadvada, that in some ways X, in some ways not X. So Akalanka's view is basically that the cow is real. It is a generic category where different members of the same species share certain similar characteristics like samana parinama, but also the parts are real. So Akalanka has a very common sense realist view. If you talk to a person on the street, they would say, yeah, the parts of the cow are real, like there's a horn and there's a leg and there's a tail, but the cow is also real. And that's Akalanka's commonsensical view. In terms of how it's related to spirituality, there's no connection that I can see, but maybe there is something that someone else can see. Because I feel this is a more theoretical debate about the relation between parts and wholes, which indirectly contributes to a system which indirectly definitely has a Jaina spiritual and Jaina orientation, soteriological orientation. But this particular thing, how it contributes to spirituality, is not something that's evident to me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, those treatises are regularly quite divorced from the spiritual path from time to time. But I believe that if you follow those very precisely, then you will end up in knowing the proper categories of reality, and then you'll become, and then the pure soul would be there, and everything which is material, yeah, I don't know. Somehow. Thank you very much. Quick over question for you, Shri. So it's about the use of Nirvikalpa and Savikalpa. So they are both pramanas in Buddhism. Can this be compared to Nirakara and Sakara, which are not pramanas per se in Jainism, but which are referred to in the context of Upayoga? Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, I think that's a very detailed and deep and good question. I mean, basically, yes. So Nirakara and Sakara is something which we see in the commentary on the Tattvartha Sutra, the Sarvartha Siddhi. And what Nirakara means is just something which is indeterminate, and Sakara means something which is determinate. And Nirakara is usually applied to Darshana, which is like this indeterminate seeing. And Sakara is usually applied to Jnana, which is like a determinate cognition. And this is very similar to Nirvikalpa in Buddhism, which is a kind of indeterminate, non-conceptual awareness, and Savikalpaka, which is a determinate conceptual awareness. So these two terms actually overlap quite a bit. And if one looks at Akalanka's definition of perception, he uses Sakara in the sense of Savikalpa. I mean, without going into too many details, based on commentaries, he uses the word Sakara in the sense of Savikalpa. So Sakara and Savikalpa are very close. I think Nirakara and Sakara are more Jaina terms, which are found in commentaries on the Tattvartha Sutras. Savikalpa and Nirvikalpa are very Buddhist terms, which originate in the Mahayana Sutras, this Vikalpa, Kalpana, and then are taken on by Buddhist philosophers. Akalanka uses both. I mean, he's both from the Jain tradition, but is also engaging with the Buddhists. So He uses Savikalpa sometimes, he uses Sakara sometimes. And in Akalanka, they basically map. I mean, Sakara is pretty much Savikalpa. Though if we go back historically in time, they originated in different traditions, and I'm sure there might be some differences between the way Vikalpa is in the Mahayana Sutras and Akara is in the Tattvartha Sutra. But in Akalanka, they kind of come together.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Jain, we have just a few more minutes. I was just a question. Could you just go back to this grammatical hierarchy of Spota? And you were speaking about how that hierarchy could be matched with the level of expressiveness of substance and mode in the Nayavada, the Jain Nayavada. But then which author was criticizing that and why? This I didn't get.
So this is Yeshu Vijaya brings us in, and it it's unclear. He doesn't specify which one in particular lines up with each one. I think trying to look at it, it's sort of jumbled. There we have the first ones. So we have in this. Oh, sorry, I need to share my screen then, right?
Oh yes, if you could.
I was looking at it, but you all weren't. So yeah, we have this list here where I would identify these first three because they are referring to the particular, so a particular morpheme we hear, a particular word, that those may be related to the paryaya. And then he more specifically says these are related to the dravya or substance because they are thinking about, the word as a whole or the word as the thing that subsists across changes, and then that into the sentence. I think he makes a claim in saying that these jati are universal spotas, insofar as they are nirvataniya or ineffable. There's an ineffable part of them, especially when we get to the final one. I think he would say that these are, again, going back to the paryaya, and that sort of goes in the order of nayas. And very interestingly, we have one of the paryaya nayas, which is the shabda naya, which the verbal naya. So I think that he would be referring to that, and I think that's where we get his critique of, well, you can't just cast off all the other ones where you have no footing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
I was trying to relate that to the Shabdanaya, especially in Pravachana.
Yeah, I think so.
The Shabdanaya, the three ones, it's the only Nayas for which the Jain philosopher don't give, a criticism.
It is?
They don't actually. They present a criticism from the people from this perspective to the grammarians. So it says, if you are from this perspective, you must criticize the grammarians, but then they don't criticize the critics of the grammarian, whether they do that in every other Naya. So this is why I was very interested in.
It's these last three sort of fit together in a way.
So we'll have to discuss that
the other
further
two
because
do
I'm really
relate to
interested.
Shabda as well.
But
I don't know if it is in this thing of like the previous one. I mean, they are presented in the form of critique, but they aren't abandoning the other. So I don't know if these would be ultimate. I mean, when you look at the examples of there is, in a sense, a piece of wood is female. I mean, what does that mean ultimately?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I really need to come back to you on this because I have a few
great.
things.
I mean, I know
a bit
specifically
technical
what you're
for today,
referencing
actually.
now with Prabhachandra. So we'll talk later.
Yeah, and I have one quick last question for Shri from Jed, from Man, I guess. So I think the Dharmakirti's view may be more nuanced than this. In the Svavriti, Svalakshana are described as Avyapadesha, admitting that even their being Kshanika is an heuristic. Thoughts? Still problems with such a view, of course.
Basically, I mean, this comment is basically correct because To say that something is momentary is not something you can perceive, because to say that something is momentary, it's like you perceive it at one moment and then don't perceive it at another moment, but you can't perceive at two moments, right? So the way you know things are momentary is through an inference. So this is like the Sattvanumana in Dharmakirti. So the fact that Swalakshanas are momentary is not something you know through perception, but know through inference. And all inferences are ultimately erroneous for Dharmakirti because they are conceptual constructs. They are ways in which we are structuring and trying to interpret our experience rather than the actual flow of experience. So to even say that Swalakshanas, these momentary dharma, these property particulars are momentary, is a kind of conceptual structuring of this flow of experience that is the reality. So strictly speaking, yes, they are like that. To say that they are momentary is an error, and ultimately that's why he says they are avyapadeshya, inexpressible, because experience is just something that it happens to you, and any attempt to like conceptualize or verbalize it is you trying to put some sort of structure and order onto experience, which necessarily is not going to be that experience itself and accurately capture that experience. And that's Dharmakirti's view. So yeah, you're right, basically.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, we'll stop here. We only have 1 minute left, so just 1 minute to say thank you for each of you. There was amazing presentations. I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your work. That's really, it's amazing. And thank you very much for everyone. And maybe Chris, you would like to share the link to the next event, which will be in 1 month on
Yes.
changing layman-decant relationships.
Thank you all
yes.
so much. Thank you, Marie-Hélène. And yeah, so our next event will be on February 10th, 2025. You can see it here on the website. I also dropped the link in the chat if you want to register there. Free registration. You can see the registration button down here in yellow. So the next topic will be changing lay-mendicant relationships. And we have Lutgard Soni was here with us today. And we'll also have Leonard Stockler from University of Birmingham and Shivani Botra from Cal State Long Beach joining us in the next event, Changing Lay-Mendicant Relationships, on February 10th, same time, same place, here online at the Dialogues in European Jain Studies speaker series. So thank you all. Thank you to our participants, and we really appreciate all your efforts, and we wish you a nice evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Jai Jinendra.